Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concept Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and I've entitled this particular podcast, Making a Change. Now, generally, when I talk about things in the podcast, I'm mentioning tips on how to have better communication, other things to think about when you might have a thought, something that sends your mind one direction and to say, well, there might be something else behind that, at least to give you some ideas about how to communicate with people, maybe get into the head of someone else, understand what they're thinking, and sort of help you become your own fix-it person. Because there's lots that goes on out there and in the world and in the minds of other people. And on that subject, when being with that other person, I'm going to segue into it this way. When being with that other person seems to bring about more pain than joy, we have to employ all kinds of magic in order to make this work. I use the word magic affectionately. But you have to be thoughtful. You have to be empathic or empathetic. And what you want to at least try to do is give the relationship the opportunity to survive. Because, there's three entities. There's your feelings, there's the other person's feelings, and then there's the relationship. So there's three things there that we're looking at. And when you're committed to the relationship, that sort of helps remind you of what you value. Because sometimes it can feel very, very difficult to be committed to that other person. Because they may just really, really bother you right now. You don't feel that they are being very loving towards you. So when you direct your intensity and you direct it at that other person, obviously, there's a lot of feelings that are behind that. But when you think about why you want to stay connected to that person, you just might not feel that. You just want to be away from that person. But remember, there's three things here. There's that other person, there's you, and there's the relationship. Now, if you want to stay committed to the relationship, see, that gives you something else to consider. And I think it's helpful to understand this aspect as to, say, think of it this way. You may make an observation of, say, someone else. I know this is a little easier sometimes to do than look at our own situation, because we can be very biased. But let's say you look at another situation and you wonder why two people are together. You say, well, that person doesn't seem to match that person. They seem to do, all they just ever seem to do is bicker. Well, to the casual observer, that may actually be the case. And one would possibly wonder, what is the commitment that they have that holds that thing together? Well, I think this explains it for you. They have a commitment to the relationship. Sometimes it's very, very hard to be committed to that other person because of how you may feel about that person. And knowing that you have the relationship to be committed to, that sort of gives you something else to hang your hat on, something that's actually a little bigger than just you or the other person. Does that kind of explain it? I hope that makes it clear. So now I'm going to transition back to why I call this making a change. Now, sometimes the relationship itself really shows that there's a lot of trouble with it. And it could be that other person who maybe they're very toxic. So being committed to the relationship may sound like a good idea, but if that person is really toxic, maybe you need to leave that relationship and take your relationship commitment values elsewhere and to start over. Now, in general, I talk about how to keep relationships together. I talk about communication. I talk about how people think, and where their thoughts and where their mind goes, and how misunderstandings happen, and how to help clear up misunderstandings. But from time to time, there does come a point where we should no longer be in that relationship because it's not safe for us to do so. Making that kind of transition can be really, really difficult. And why is that? It can be that way, one, because like I say, we've learned to be committed to that entity, that third entity being the relationship. And because we value that in our lives so much, it makes it seem like there's something that we want to hang on to, because if we don't, then we might feel like a failure. It could be the perception about the relationship itself falling apart, or about it, and by perception I mean how it may look to other people and the way it reflects upon us as being a failure. Now, these are all outside things. I mean, they affect us on the inside, but these are all outside things, and these are really big challenges for us to come to terms with, in addition to the fear. And the fear could be of being alone. So it seems like having a relationship, having that entity in your life makes you feel more secure, even though the other person could be toxic or dangerous or something to us, maybe even jeopardize our safety. And it's in those places where we have difficulty in sometimes understanding why it's better for us to leave that kind of situation. Like I said, there could be very, very good reasons to be fearful of that. And in a sense, I'm talking about domestic violence, the fear of being harmed. And that in-between spot where you're afraid to leave because that person has put a lot of thoughts into your head that if you leave, you're really going to be unsafe. So you wonder, is it safer to be with that person or to not be with that person? Obviously, we probably feel a lot safer not in their presence, but it's the fear of the retaliation. Now, that's not to say that that's all worked up in our heads, because I'm sure we know of situations where something like this happens. We hear about people getting hurt when they were trying to leave a domestic situation because one or the other is really volatile. Well, these things are very, very hard to do in isolation. And that's something that I'm going to talk about, is when an abuser isolates you from all of your other lifelines. That's a sense of power and control. And it's important to recognize when those kinds of things are happening. Because when an abuser has the control of your circumstances, of your situation, in order to make it hard for you to leave, then, you've been cut off. It's like you crossed here on a bridge, but now the bridge has been taken away. How do you leave now? If it's a river, and it's probably hard to swim that river, it's just, how are you going to get out of these situations? This is very difficult. It's very scary. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Some of the warning signs, and namely, to not isolate yourself. Think of people that you can share your situation with so they can check on you and help you get out of these kinds of things, because like I say, they are very scary. And to emphasize that these situations are not specific to just women. Men have been victims of domestic violence oftentimes as well. And so I share that as a point of education, so that if you're hearing something about this from a guy, then it's important that he get help and support also. It is not something to be made fun of. Take it very seriously. I'm going to take a pause, and I'll be back after this. Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. I've entitled this podcast, Making a Change. And what I'm specifically talking about is domestic violence. And in that first segment, I outlined a number of things. How to leave, the warning signs, sharing your situation, and the fact that this happens to both men and women, I think, is significant. The circumstances in which men seem to face domestic violence, it really has an interesting twist to it, because there are a lot of things that are ingrained in how people perceive things should be. Quite often we don't think of men being victims in domestic violence. And I'm not talking necessarily about same-sex couples. I'm speaking specifically of couples where men and women are together, and the idea that a woman could be physically abusive towards a man, a lot of people, that idea, it escapes them. Just simply because we have these old concepts that because women are perceived as being less strong than men, that a man can't be overpowered. And it's the irony here is we're thinking of physical strength, when quite often when we're talking about domestic violence, it's not just the physical thing, but it's the mental part about it. It's the brainwashing. It's the conversations that go back and forth, the bickering, which can be verbal in nature, but it's the things that are said. We used to say sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. That is a lie. Words do hurt, and people find themselves in these circumstances oftentimes and not even realize they're in the situation, because it just tends to grow with the relationship, and where we may find disagreements fairly common, resolving disagreements is obviously very important. And using the tools that we have in conversation, empathy, the kinds of things that show compassion and a desire to resolve it, those things may be there, but everybody doesn't necessarily possess the skills to represent themselves very well. You may have someone who is very skilled at persuasion, and that could work at times to be helpful, but there's also the other side, when those skills of persuasion can seem fairly on more of an edgier way. It could be more menacing, and that's scary to deal with. And consider that we do take domestic violence very seriously in this country, that quite often men feel very afraid to even say that there is something going on with them. And I'm talking, the men-women relationships, same-sex couples, we don't necessarily have the same stereotype operating. I mean, and there's a bit of a shift, and I can, I may be able to get to that and explain that in a bit, but I'm talking more specifically about men and women and some of the situations that men find themselves in because of the sort of thing about the masculinity, and guys not really being there to share their feelings as much, and saying that they are a victim of something is not a very masculine thing to project. So guys tend to go very silent on these kinds of things. Well, I can tell you that when it comes to discussions and someone being persuasive, whether in a nice way or in a menacing way, as you notice, it really doesn't necessarily depend on whether you're a man or a woman who's making the conversation. If you're a woman who's very persuasive and you're telling your guy he'd better do something or else, what's the or else? Is it something she might try to smear him? She might insinuate he did something? Or in the case of a lot of people, maybe there's something that we feel very ashamed about, and this person who's making the threat holds that over our head. So these things can become very insidious, and something that happens quite often or the circumstances that quite often people are raised in environments where this is normal, or it's so common that it appears to be normal. So when I use the word normal, I don't mean that it's okay. I mean that it happens so often that the absence of these kinds of conflicts or this sort of bickering seems to be really strange. And when it comes to navigating this sort of stuff, it can be very, very challenging. What we tend to recognize as being domestic violence is when we see the physical scars. That's clear and that's evident. That's the kind of proof that some people need. Well, I'm here to explain to you that quite often it's the mental part. And one of the things that happens in these situations is when an abuser cuts off the victim from the rest of their connections, their lifelines, be it family members, be it friends, because these individuals may be able to tell that something is going on. And the reason an abuser wants to cut you off from those other sources of contact is to, one, control you, and it's also to help avoid detection of what they're doing. So oftentimes it's very calculated, because in order to keep you under control, they have to dominate your experience. So if you are feeling like you are being cut off, so I want to take it here. So if you are a person who's in a situation similar to some of the things that I've just described, meaning you're feeling cut off, maybe you've recognized that you've been raised in an environment that experiences this kind of bickering, and you have at one point treated it as though it were normal, and having grown to where you are in life now and feel something in the way of some tension around this and trying to work it out. Maybe you have a person, maybe you're involved with somebody who grew up in the same kind of environment. So you go round and round and round with this stuff, and it's another form of dysfunction. And until you get in and start unraveling what's behind all of this, you just get stuck in that cycle. And these, people being where they, who they are, some people are very explosive with their temper, and they lash out, be it physically or verbally. And, those are the kind of things that you need to make a change from. You need to make yourself safe. Getting out of these situations. So now that we've recognized something, learning that getting out of these situations is the next step. Again, a very, very scary move, because we hear statistically how people have tried to escape domestic violence in these situations, and something bad happens. They've trying to get out, get away. They tried to get restraining orders, and that in between place where between being safe and being fully exposed, there's a lot of variables there. And it can be a very, very scary place to be. And if you've been cut off, it's kind of like, well, what do I do? I mean, where do I turn? So it sort of makes it important that you have a lifeline. You let people know where you are. And that's just in general. I'm going to take a break, and I will come back and fill in some of the blanks here on some of the stuff that I've raised as a topic. Stay tuned.
The GSMC Sex Podcast is a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet. Download the GSMC Sex Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you can find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hi there, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast, and I'm talking about making a change. And the topic in particular that I'm covering is domestic violence. And so I'm going to just point out a few things here and I'm talking about abusive relationships. And if some of these things tend to fall in line with what you're experiencing, then it's certainly worth you thinking sincerely about the quality of the relationship, what's going on for you. For example, humiliation. If you feel like your partner is humiliating you, it just seems like it's just an ongoing thing, that's something to consider. They don't encourage your passions. You're receiving lots of verbal insults. If there's physical violence, controlling behavior, just being unpredictable, picking at your faults, alienating you from your friends and family. And earlier I talked about being cut off. And when you have these other people who you would relate to, and in general, we're social creatures. And being cut off from everyone, being isolated, those are the kinds of situations where abusers tend to be able to take control and have an incredible amount of power over you in your situation. So that's something to, again, consider in your situation. Placing the blame on you for things that happen, just always placing the blame on you, and the other person manipulates situations, circumstances, manipulates you. Quite often they have, in addition to that, they would have calculated outbursts, and they may blame you for them having their outbursts. These are just the kinds of things that abusers do. That it happens every once in a while might not be that of telling you that you have a situation that's ripe for you need to get out. But it's usually when these things repeat themselves. And certainly when you get to the area of physical violence, that it's very terrorizing and makes people very fearful. That's definitely a bad sign, and you want to get help with that. So here in the States, there is a national domestic violence hotline, and that would be a number 1-800-799-7233. Again, that's 1-800-799-7233. There are lots of resources. And if you're in a situation where you have some fear, if you can get away and do some research, if you have a cell phone, you might be able to look this thing up or get on a computer, type in domestic violence and see what pops up for you. And you can start getting help that way. If you have been physically abused, I would certainly implore you to call the authorities, police, get some help. And all the information that I have is that when a physical altercation has happened and there is a proof that, say, a responding officer sees that there has been some trauma, some scratches, bruising, something like that, they will arrest the offender. That's just, they are mandated to do so. So that's just some information going forward. And if you are in a situation like that, please get to a safe place. Tell somebody, let them know what you're going through, what you're dealing with. I know that can be very, very difficult for a lot of people to be able to take on. Again, because of all the mental manipulation that goes on from abusers to their victims. And it can happen to either men or women. And during some of my preparation for this segment, here's some of the things that I came up with. So if you feel afraid of your partner much of the time, these are some of your inner thoughts and feelings. You may be in an abusive relationship. So if you feel afraid of your partner much of the time, say maybe you avoid certain topics out of fear of angering your partner, or maybe you feel like you can't do anything right. Maybe you feel like you deserve to be hurt or mistreated. See, that's, again, some of the mental manipulation that abusers are able to affect their victims. It's crazy how that happens that you would actually feel like you deserve to be hurt. And here's another one. You might wonder if you're the one that's crazy, because abusers are really good at flipping the script, putting you at fault for things, and you with a clear mind are able to point these things out, but then you question yourself. So again, you wonder if you're the one that's crazy. Maybe you might feel emotionally numb or just plain helpless. See, those are some of the signs. Again, those are your inner thoughts. This inner voice that's talking to you, and you're wondering about this. Man, is this me? Now, some of your partner belittling behavior, it could be, do they humiliate or yell at you? Do they criticize and put you down? Maybe they treat you badly. They embarrass you in front of your friends. Maybe they ignore you or put down your opinions or accomplishments. And, another one that I had mentioned is blaming you for their own abusive behavior towards you. In other words, blaming you for them attacking you. Maybe they see you as property or a sex object rather than as a person. These are some of the things that are warning signs. So if you're experiencing some of this stuff, it really is something for you to pause and try to get a safe place and start to reflect on these things. And this is where, when you have a lifeline, when you have people, when you're not isolated, you can kind of bounce this off of someone, at least tell them your story, tell them what's going on, and they may be able to help you with this. And at least get you to a clear, get clearer thoughts around it. And I think that's so very important, because when you're in the midst of this, it is so hard to see your way out of it. What I imagine people experience is more of the fear, because a lot of people know that they are in bad situations, but they don't know what to do about it. So again, a bit ago, I gave you a phone number, and that would be for the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And that number would be 1-800-799-7233. Again, that's 1-800-799-7233. Now, I repeated that for emphasis. So, to the question of why people don't leave, and I know for those who have not experienced domestic violence, it seems a mystery. And I have to really underscore this, and it is about the fear of leaving. The fear of, in many cases, it's about being alone. A lot of times in these situations, these people have been isolated from the rest of the way, and I'm going to use the word normal, people operate for so long that they don't realize, I'm talking about the victims, don't realize they are in a situation oftentimes. Sometimes they know they're in a situation. They don't know what to do about it. They're very afraid. They have been traumatized to the point where believing that if they leave, bad things are going to happen to them. And there are statistics out there that actually support that there are times when people have tried to leave relationships and some very, very scary things have happened. There is a lot of danger in these things. And I'm not going to not emphasize the fact that when you are afraid, sometimes it feels safer just to be where you're at until you can think through it. And that thinking through it part sometimes takes a long time to process. Again, it's all because of fear. You feel trapped. So again, I emphasize, if you know of somebody who is in a situation like this, reach out to them. Do it in a safe way so that the victim themselves don't feel like they are being exposed. This is not the time to put their stuff on blast. Communicate with them. See what you can do to get them the information and find out how you best may be able to help them. It might be just enough to at least know that they have a lifeline that will give them some sense of peace, some sense of calm, and work it from there. Because what we don't want to do in these situations is give the abuser the knowledge that the victim is trying to leave. Because oftentimes this is when things escalate. And so it's about keeping them safe. And if you know of something that is happening to someone, then maybe you've heard somehow, like I say, reach out to them if you can, or call the authorities. Get somebody there to help them. And because the last thing I think any of us would want to feel like happens is to know about a situation like this and to not have taken action and to find out, there were some tragic results because of it, because of our inaction. It takes courage. I mean, if you can imagine, if you're hearing about your friend and you are afraid for your friend's safety, imagine what they're going through being there with the abuser. That's really rough. This stuff it's really bad stuff. And for the dysfunction that happens in relationships like this, maybe both partners have grown up in these kinds of environment. So it almost seems like they find each other and they keep this thing going. Well, hopefully somebody intercedes on the behalf of any individual that is being abused so that we can fix this and get them safe and break the cycle of violence. I hope this has been helpful. I'm John Johnson, and this is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast, talking about making a change.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.